Welcome to a new season of Christian Conversations with Strathearn United Church. In today's lecture with Reverend Sandy, the topic is the 100th anniversary of the United Church of Canada and our creeds. We hope that you'll enjoy this opportunity to listen, to learn, and to reflect. Thank you for joining us.
Well, welcome and another of our lectures as we prepare. This is the lecture that gives you the context and the background for those who wish to join in our conversation next week. It's in the bulletin and all the other bits and pieces. And if you ever drive by Strathearn, you'll see the sign which tells you what time and date. And we're always willing to invite other folks to be part of our conversation. So what are we talking about this time? Well, we're taking the opportunity, this being the 100th anniversary of the United Church of Canada, we're taking the opportunity to look at credal statements. And I think we've had this kind of conversation before in a larger sense. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the larger question of creeds and the church, but I want to focus more on the United Church. But I will give some general background. And as always, there's lots of stories from my own experience. As I've mentioned quite often, I didn't grow up in the church. I had no real grounding in the church at all. I only knew about church from television when I was growing up, and the culture in Scotland, which was very much a kind of, unfortunately, I have to say, a bigoted culture between Protestants and Catholics. And my historical background, my historical interest, I should say, which led me to have a fairly jaundiced view about religion as well. And interestingly enough, I was never keen on credal statements. I hesitate to mention this. One of the reasons why. When I was younger, there was a series of films called the Omen series that was all about Damien, the end of the world, the Antichrist, and all that kind of stuff. And the films were very, very scary. Lots of kind of overwrought satanic choir music and this kind of stuff. Maybe we should get our choir to practice some of those, get some kind of dramatic music going. But there was a scene in particular that stuck in my mind where it showed like the kind of satanic worshippers all rattling off the same kind of satanic creed at the same time. And they all kind of looked very intense and very kind of like ready to do whatever they were planning to do in the name of evil. And it was pretty scary what they were doing. So credal statements in general, I felt were at this time, there was something odd about this idea of the church all reciting something at the same time. It was when I entered the church and became a Christian and started to realize that there was more going on. Credal statements play a very important role, and the core role of a credal statement, and it goes right back to there are credal statements within the Bible itself, in both First and Second Testaments. And there was very much a tradition of statements of faith. Some mentioned in Deuteronomy, how to serve God and love God as you love your neighbor, and all these kind of ways of summing up what you believe. Some of the Psalms were read as communal readings, as a congregation gathering together to give thanks, Psalm 100 in particular. One of the most moving moments in the First Testament is when the exiles returned from Babylon to Jerusalem and to start the process of rebuilding. And in the midst of all that, Ezra and Nehemiah talk about the need of renewal. And one way of renewal begins reading the law, reciting the law. So there is a very well-established vision of a community that says together what we believe. What do we stand for? What's important in our faith? I think, and there are credal statements within the Second Testament and the letters of Paul and the book of Acts about, what do we believe? They would become more established within the church when the church would become more of an institution. When the church became an institution within the Roman Empire, the Roman emperors who first tolerated the existence of Christianity, then supported the existence of Christianity, had a very clear agenda. They began to see the church as a tool to maintain Roman power. So to maintain Roman power, there needed to be a unified church vision. To put it simply, everyone had to be singing from the same hymn sheet, which was a problem. A problem because Christianity is a very diverse system. Christianity is multiple visions of how to live in relationship with God, different understandings of the Godhood, different understandings of Christ, a whole bunch of different understandings. And so part of that clashed with this idea of a unified state vision. Church councils were set up, the Council of Nicaea and various others, and part of the discussion process was setting up credal statements. But this is what we believe. The Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed. And if you want to read these credal statements, you can find them online anywhere, just rattle in Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed. They're in Voices United as well. And the idea being these were kind of statements of belief, that people would recite them and whatever. And they have been very much part of the Christian landscape for centuries, even millennia. Churches today, many churches today will still recite the Apostles' Creed. I'm sure I've shared my own issues with the Apostles' Creed down to my, my tortured past in my internship, and I won't share again. But if you haven't heard the story, you can certainly get hold of me after worship, and I'm more than happy to bore you to tears with it. But the Apostles' Creed is still considered to be the creedal statement for many churches. The language hasn't substantively changed. It's obviously been translated into a variety of languages, but the vision of what you're supposed to believe as a Christian has been consistent. So that's the larger picture. Creedal statements have been important in both Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant churches as part of a way of expressing faith. So how does this relate to the United Church of Canada, the history of the United Church of Canada? We celebrated our 100th anniversary. Officially, we were created in June 1925. That was the process of a long-established process of negotiations and discussions between the Presbyterian Church of Canada, the Methodist Churches of Canada, the Congregationalist Churches of Canada, and what we now refer to as the Union Churches. Those were Protestant churches that were formed throughout the West, though there was a couple of examples. There was one example in Halifax, United Memorial. The reason I know that is because I was there as a student minister in my first year at seminary at the AST, so I remember it quite fondly. So that's how we formed. The United Church was born out of a growing movement of ecumenism. What does ecumenism mean? It is the belief that Christian denominations should engage in closer cooperation based on a variety of reasons. That in the 19th century in particular, there was a feeling that the churches had grown apart too much. The doctrinal issues between Catholic and Protestant being one of the more obvious ones, but within the Protestant tradition, there was lots of division. We celebrate Reformation Sunday coming up, and that's part of our legacy. The legacy of the Reformed tradition is when you give people the power to chart their futures within the church, you have to be ready for when they use that power in ways that you might not have agreed with. Churches divide, and they divide over a variety of interpretations, doctrine, governance, theology, place of the church in the world, and all this kind of stuff. Ecumenism was this vision that for the Christian faith to continue and to flourish, that the barriers should come down. The barriers should be suspended and replaced with cooperation, and in some cases, unity. Especially because one of the challenges was that there was the beginning of the secular movement, and people were concerned that the churches would not have the resources to reach out to people, to, because they were too busy competing with one another, and they weren't realizing the bigger picture, which was to continue to share the good news. So that's the larger picture. What is the Canadian context? The Canadian context. At first, as a French colony, and then a British colony, Canada would have a variety of religious traditions, Christian traditions that were rooted in the West, particularly Britain and France. Britain itself was a sectarian nation, is a sectarian nation. The Church of England is still technically the official church in England. In Scotland, it's a slightly more complicated. The Church of Scotland has a more nebulous position, but it is fair to say that between the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, they had very much strong holds in their society. I'm not sure about what Wales. Wales has the unfortunate situation of always being kind of like shoulder shrug. But in terms of religious belief, Church of England, profoundly Anglican, the main Anglican church. The Church of Scotland, very much Presbyterian. In Wales, dissenting Protestant, Baptist, Congregationalist, and as well as Presbyterian and Anglican as well. France, would the French influence would be predominantly Roman Catholic in Quebec, but there was also some Huguenots. Huguenots are French Calvinists, and so they would gravitate towards the Presbyterian strand. So you have all these British and French religious traditions. The Methodist Church would emerge from the Anglican Church as a reaction to the Anglican Church being too closely tied with the kind of the English establishment. And they would be very popular in North America in particular. As I mentioned, dissenting churches. These were Protestant churches that emerged in the 17th, 16th, and 17th century. We know them as Puritans, and so they would play a critical role in settling in New England, and later on, through Loyalists, would settle in Nova Scotia and the like, and Ontario. For instance, St. Matthew's United Church in Halifax, one of its starting components was dissenting Protestants who set up shop, as it were, in the mid 18th century. That's 250 years ago. So there's a whole strong variety of church experiences. The Anglican Church in Canada is not a state church in the same way that the Church of England was in England, but it would still play an important social role. The Presbyterians would be kind of focused in various scripts, like I remember someone once said, usually Presbyterian churches are named Knox, Calvin, or some numerical designation. You might see the odd one. Like I personally remember being somewhat surprised that the Presbyterian church in Halifax I went to a couple of times was called St. David, because I was like, why would you have a Presbyterian church named St. David? And discovered the story. It's kind of complicated. But so these are religious traditions that are rooted in the British experience. The American experience would become through, as I mentioned, Congregationalists, Baptists. There are a substantive number of Baptist churches in the Maritimes. A United Baptist denomination is fairly very well established in the Maritimes. So these religious traditions would become part of the landscape, and sometimes literally. One of my experiences when I was, many years ago, Jen and I took the train from Halifax to Quebec City. And one of the things I remember when we were driving, when the train was going through various towns in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, you'd see like 3 or 4 steeples. You'd see, which is now the United Church steeple, the Baptist steeple, the Anglican steeple, and the Catholic steeple. Each town would have quite a few churches. And once you kind of cross the border into Quebec, you only see one steeple. That's your lot, and it's usually the Catholic steeple. So, part of the landscape. But in the West, when the West started to being settled, especially the prairie provinces started to be settled, there was a shift. And this would where the Union churches would emerge. People were saying we can't have all these different churches. We can't have a Baptist, a Presbyterian, a Methodist, and whatever. We've only got the energy for one church, so let's form what we now call Union churches. And in many ways, these are the precursors of the United Church, rooted in Canadian consensus, compromise, whatever language you want. So that's the kind of the context. There's a recognition by the late 19th century something needs to change. Patterns of immigration were bringing in large numbers of people into Canada who were not part of the original colonizing countries. Eastern Europeans were coming in, Icelanders were coming in, they were bringing the Orthodox traditions, the Lutheran traditions, and various others. And, this is the colonial mindset. I mean, these people needed to be assimilated. That was the mindset. You need to find a way to make them Canadian. How do you make them Canadian? Well, religion is seen as a way. Unfortunately, there's the legacy of residential schools. It was a more, the extreme aspect of that mindset. But if you come to Canada, you need to be assimilated, and religion is one way to do that. So, how do you do that? Also, there's another thing, a growing sense of Canada being its own nation, its own pathing its own course. This is especially becomes more and more clear beginning in the 1920s. At the end of the trauma of the First World War, when Canada had suffered such horrific losses in the battles of the Western Front, there was a sense of what does the future of Canada look like? We are part of this British Empire, but we're a dominion, we're a self-governing dominion. What should our relationship be with the mother country and all that kind of language and all that kind of stuff? Should Canada be pushing its own course forward? I give one of my favorite examples of that. We often talk of this imagery of when does Canada become a nation? When does Canada stand up for itself? And traditionally, people talk about the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Canada went on whatever. Not to disparage what happened at Vimy Ridge, I tend to think there's a much better example of when Canada became a nation. There was a crisis called the Shannak crisis. This was in the aftermath of the First World War. Turkey had been an Axis power and had Central power, mixed up by wars, and had suffered the consequences of defeat. Britain wanted to keep Turkey down, wanted to keep them in their place, and the crisis had blown up, and Britain needed troops to deal with the Turks. And they sent a request. Well, it was actually more of a demand than anything, but it was covered as a request, and it said to Canada and Australia and New Zealand, standard issue practice, British imperialist action, we need some troops, hope you lot can sign on, and we'll teach the Turks a lesson. Canada said, no, we're not interested. This doesn't serve Canada's interests. We're not sending our boys to be killed in an imperialist war that doesn't threaten us, doesn't even really concern us. And Britain was flabbergasted. Colonial powers are not used to their dominions telling them, yeah, we're not going to get involved. Why do I tell that story? Because it's part of that change. The 1920s is these kind of major steps for Canada becoming a nation. When you tell your mother country, yeah, we're not interested, you're in the process of becoming your own nation. And I think this is part of an illustration of the context of the United Church of Canada. Okay, so let's talk about the United Church of Canada for a bit. The United Church of Canada was the end process of a lot of discussions. Discussions had began at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century when representatives of the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and the Union churches would meet to discuss what is our future. How will we continue to spread the good news of Jesus Christ in this new emerging country that is Canada? And when we have all these new people coming in from different parts of the world, how will we evangelize? How will we reach out to these people? Is the legacy of our past something that can both strengthen us, but can also be a challenge to us? How do we create a church shaped by the Canadian context? And I think this is a very important point when we look at questions of creedal statements and what we believe and all this kind of stuff. Is one of the ongoing tensions of Christianity as a whole is that tension between evolution and, I'm trying to think of the best way of putting this, staying the course. This is how things have always been done. The Apostles' Creed being recited in churches over 1,500 years and more. That vision between churches saying, we live in a different time. We are shaped by new experiences. How do we, as Protestant churches that are born out of the British experience, reach out to someone from Ukraine, someone from Iceland, someone from, and later on, someone from Japan, someone from China, India? How do we, Korea? How do we evangelize? How do we make people feel welcome? And at the same time, fulfill our agenda of assimilation. So, lots of conversations. When I was at AST, the Atlantic School of Theology, and doing my MDiv, we were an ecumenical school, but on Wednesdays was our formation day. That's when we were learning to be United Church ministers. So we as United Church students would gather and we would go over a variety of United Church bits and pieces. So for example, governance, paperwork. How do we submit our paperwork? Licenses, and doctrine. What do we believe? And we had to write papers as part of our process of becoming United Church ministers. We had to express our beliefs. What do we believe? There's a kind of catch-all phrase, I'm in essential agreement with that statement, which is basically you tie crossing your fingers behind your back saying, I don't really believe that, but I want to get through the process. It's probably a state secret. But we were to learn doctrine. And so then we were introduced to a variety of faith statements of the United Church. And I will be talking about that in a few moments. But the United Church began its faith declarations with what are called the 20 Articles of Doctrine. Now, I'm sure if we were to put that in our bulletin or on our notice board, come to Strathern United Church and celebrate the 20 Articles of Doctrine, we would be lining up out the door. Well, maybe. Different language, 1925, and that's when we were born. These 20 articles shared various, you can find, and all these things I make reference to, you will find on the United Church of Canada website. Go under, good start is to go to the United Church of Canada webpage, go to the Faith and Community section. There, one of the headings is Faith Statements. And once you go into Faith Statements, then you will see all these we're talking about. The 20 Articles of Doctrine, the 1940 Statement, the Creed that we recite as part of our worship, and the Song of Faith. And you will see, and you'll be able to access all these, and if you read them all, and you can try and catch me out, see how much I know, and which is not very much. So, Article 1, this is how it all begins. Of God. This is the 20 articles. We believe in the one only living and true God, a spirit infinite and eternal and unchangeable. In his being and perfections, the Lord Almighty, who is love, most just in all his ways, most glorious in holiness, unsearchable in wisdom, plenteous in mercy, full of compassion and abundant in goodness and truth. We worship him in the unity of the Godhead and the mystery of the Holy Trinity. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, three persons of the same substance, equal in power and glory. And then all the other articles, it goes on. You know, 1925, kind of standard stuff for a church, that the language is probably by our standards heavy-handed. It's certainly patriarchal. And then you go into the actual 20 articles and you'll notice that there are subtle differences in some of them. Sometimes they don't fully click. And the reason is when you have a bunch of Presbyterians, Methodists, and Congregationalists all in the same room trying to agree on stuff, they are going, if you have a choice to make. You can either be open to consensus and kind of turn a blind eye to those moments when they don't all agree, but this is the important thing, is to be part of something. Or you can demand certainty. And if you demand certainty, you're not going to get consensus. So, as I said, do I agree with the 20 articles of doctrine? I said I agree in the way that I accept that sometimes they contradict one another. Is that me being a smart aleck? Yes. Guilty as charged, but it's also true. They do disagree with one another. There are subtle differences, but as I said, Presbyterians have one vision of grace, Methodists tend to have another vision of grace, and the details do tend to differ. And so that's how we started off. In 1940, we had a statement of faith. That's on the website. We acknowledge God as creator, upholder, and sovereign Lord of all things. And then there's a long preamble about the statement and similar kind of language. 1940s, Canada is continuing to emerge as its own country. The United Church has now been around for 15 years and it's becoming more of a unified body. These working on doctrines and beliefs. The creed that we recite as part of our worship, it was issued in 1968. And I feel it's one of the best creedal statements I've read. It's a nice, effective, clear, concise story of narration, a narrative of faith, narrative of revelation, and it's also dynamic. God created and is creating. There is more to come from this story. I personally, as I said, I've read other creedal statements, the United Church of Christ in the States, the Maasai Creed, and various other creedal statements around the world. As far as I'm concerned, the United Church of Canada creedal statement can't really be improved upon. And as I said, we got into the habit of reciting. I know in the past, many years we might recite it now and again, but now we recite it every week. I think it's a useful vision of who we are. There's a song of faith. I'll confess I've not engaged with that as much as I probably should have as a United Church minister. There's and I know that some folks in the congregation have been more effective and more proactive in talking about a song of faith. I think it is a good narrative. It's a good vision, and I think it does invite us to be part of the ongoing story. And maybe that's a topic for another day on the Song of Faith, and we can certainly explore that. And I know that has been explored here in the congregation. So we have these statements. What I will point out about these statements is the process of evolution, language. The 1968 creedal statement, for instance, I find the language to be more engaging. It's not top heavy. It's not like, we believe in the sovereign God who controls everything. That's kind of, I'm being silly, but I think when you talk about God to people, I think one of the challenges we face is what are people saying? What do people think about God? And so when you have a creedal statement, What do you want that to say about God? What do you want to say about your relationship with God? And so I find the version in 1968, the God I encounter in that statement is a more mutual, more supportive, more, I can have a conversation. The creedal statement's more part of a conversation with God, whereas earlier statements are very kind of, the language is grand, it's dramatic. This is the revelation of God. And, and I think that probably spoke to the people at that time. One of the challenges we've been facing in the last 100 years is kind of the age-old question: how do we talk about God? How much of the legacy of the past shapes our understanding of God? And is it okay for us to say we have different ways of looking at God? We have imagery, like, I think one of the things that we forget is how we speak about God is shaped by our popular media. One of the things I remember, one of the things that kind of startled me when I started to explore imagery of Jesus, for example, is I was so used to the Western vision of Jesus, of fair skin, bearded, intense eyes, kind of wearing kind of what people thought the clothes of the period, to discover that some of the earliest visual portrayals of Jesus have him clean shaven, that he looks more like a Roman citizen, because that's who we're drawing him, were Roman citizens, and the Romans were clean shaven. So, well, at that period they were. So, how we view God is not just shaped by our relationship with the Bible or our creedal statements, but as the world around us. And creedal statements, I think, we're not beholden, but I think it's useful for us to remember we are part of a culture that has evolved. But the Apostles' Creed was a reflection of, for example, the Apostles' Creed was a reflection of an imperialist Roman Christianity. It was established by a group of bishops summoned by the emperor of Rome to say, I need a Christianity that works for me, get on it. And if you don't sign on the dotted line, then we need to have a conversation, and there's a good chance it might involve something sharp and dangerous. So, is it appropriate for us to say, is this something we could just stick to, or can we not say? And maybe, for instance, why do we have a Song of Faith? Because people were not satisfied with the new creed. And they felt it was limiting. And that's who we are as a church, because, we've talked a little bit about these creeds, and I haven't went into great detail about the nuts and bolts, because, if you want the information, they're on the website, and it tells you how to download and read. And, and I'm hopefully giving you some context about why these creeds evolved, but I want to kind of look at some fundamental questions, and some questions for us to explore. Is it necessary for a member of the United Church to read a Song of Faith, the New Creed, the 1940 Statement of Faith, or the 20 Articles of Doctrine? Do you need to believe in all of them to be a member of the United Church? Well, in 1925, when you read the 20 Articles of Doctrine, you probably were expected to at least give it the good old college try in believing them. That there was an expectation that as a member of the United Church, you would hold to these truths, as it were. As time has passed, I think it's fair to say that as we of the United Church have tended to evolve to being a more open-ended relationship with creedal statements. And what I mean by that is we're, especially the older statements, there's not the expectation that we claim to say, I swear that I will believe all of this, that they are members of the United Church who would say, I don't believe Jesus literally rose from the grave. They may give some other explanation what the resurrection experience means for them. Now, in 1925, would they be considered to be members of the United Church? Probably not. That's what we believed. That's what our statement said. But now, in some congregations, there might be a bit of a conservative. Well, at least you still believe in God. I'm being flip, but what I'm saying is what we believe may not be sort of reflected in the specifics of a creedal statement. But do I believe creeds are important? Yes, I do. I believe creeds continue to be important, that they're a reminder, not just a reminder of who we used to be, what we used to believe, but a reminder that we are part of something. We are part of a larger vision, a larger story, a larger, idea. Doctrine is not a strict requirement for membership of the United Church as it used to be. And, members of the United Church are often judged by other denominations which have very clear ideas of doctrine, that we're loosey-goosey and all that kind of stuff, that we're not really that serious about our faith. That's rubbish as far as I'm concerned. We are serious about our faith. We are serious in ways that are maybe different. We are serious about our faith in the sense that we know that it's rooted in the world that we're part of. Our faith evolves. I have expressed various frustrations of the United Church over my years, but one thing in terms of vision, if not always in reality, but in terms of vision, I've always felt that the United Church tries to be a growing church, not so much in numbers on pews, as it were, but a church that grows through experience, that grows in the sense that we will change. In 1925, we did not ordain women. I am not sure exactly when the first minister was a female or was ordained as a minister, but it was within 10 to 15 years of the formation of the United Church. And that was very early compared with many Christian denominations. If you'd said in 1925 that by 1988 that we would be starting the process of ordaining gay clergy, they would have said you were nuts, that you're crazy. But we did. We grow, we evolve, we change. Our creedal statements are part of that story of change. In New Creed statement in 1968, the line was raised with respecting creation, because we believed that it was important, because that was part of who we're changing. We, in our 100-year period, the United Church has 4 different descriptions of what it means to have faith. 4 different descriptions of theology, doctrine, whatever term you want to use. Some may decry this as a church being trendy, instead of accepting supposedly universal declarations of belief. I would suggest that the reality is this is how we express our faith. It's something that should be constantly evolving. And it begins with the beginning. This is one of the cornerstones of Paul's ministry, and Paul's ministry to the churches around the Mediterranean, some that he helped to create, was rooted in his desire to include new voices, new visions, new experiences. For the church to continue to survive, for the church to have an opportunity to flourish, we need to evolve. And our creedal statements need to be part of that process. They need to be part of a shift, of an understanding of who God is. We're not being trendy. We're being realistic. We live in a changing world. How we state our faith should reflect that experience. What was important for the 20 Articles of Doctrine, which helped establish the United Church, so they are critical documents, might not be so meaningful to a person in the pews today, but what they do want to hear is God cares for them. And the language of the 1925 20 articles is maybe more heavy-handed, but if you listen to it, if you sift through it, there is God's care for us. It's maybe more paternalistic, more kind of top down, because that's what the world believed. The world believed that's what God was like. And many people still do. We in the United Church have a variety of opinions of what God is and who God is in our lives. And our creedal statements, I feel, give us an opportunity to explore that kind of language, to explore that kind of vision and such. How we express our faith should be an invitation. We want people to be part of our story. Our creedal statements should be an invitation, not gatekeeping. And that's one of the reasons why I appreciate the 1968 New Creed, is I find it to be an invitation. This is who God is. This is who God is in the world. This is who we say God is. This is the God we hope will inspire our witness, our mission. And it's, to me, it's shared in a way that is meaningful, that is simple, concise, and respectful. It respects the people who are part of that, that vision. So I think I'm just going to kind of wrap things up in terms of, hopefully I've, in the course of this, I've kind of shed some light. And as I said, I didn't go into details, because, I had to go for details when I was in AST, and it was like, oh, please. We were always worried about whether they're going to ask us various questions about whatever articles for our ordination interview, and we were kind of panicking about, did we know that one well enough and all that kind of stuff, not knowing that we were being asked by people who went through the same process themselves and were probably, still triggered by those experiences. So I hope I've given a kind of some insights, some thoughts, and I should always stress that these are parts of my own journey. These are not gospel truth, and it illustrates something I've always been very important for people to understand, is that the church is shaped by people who bring to the table their experiences of faith. The creedal statements are the products of groups of people who gather together to kind of coalesce their visions of faith and their visions of belief into something that was kind of something that would be a conversation, not just something you should believe, but more so, this is who we are. Let's go from there. So I'm going to close with prayer, and then we'll be done. So, God, we give you thanks for the word of Scripture, the word of creeds, and the people who took your words, listened to them, shared them with one another to express their hope, their vision of who we could be as people. And through these words became your story. Amen.